Hey everybody, welcome back to The Current. This is Pastor Chris Nafis, pastor of Living Water Church, and glad to have you join us today. I'm in a new location today. We're kind of bouncing around trying to figure out the best place to do this podcast that's easily accessible and that has decent sound and not horrible visuals. So I'm up here on the 12th floor of the apartment building above our church today. They've been gracious enough to let me try it out up here. You may hear some cityscape in the background today, so please just enjoy the sounds of the city behind whatever my voice sounds like to you. But today we are back here in Acts. I want to thank Eric Paul for joining me last week. Next week we're going to have hopefully a fascinating conversation with a friend of mine from seminary named Carrie Willis, pastor and chaplain to folks on death row in North Carolina and Virginia. So looking forward to that. But today we're back in Acts. We're in Acts 1, verses 12 through the end of the chapter. I'm not going to read the whole passage because it's a bit long, and you can always pause this video and check it out yourself, which I would encourage you to do if you're interested. But this is the passage where the disciples, the apostles, go back to Jerusalem as Jesus has told them. Jesus has just ascended to be with the Father, told them, go wait for me in Jerusalem. The Spirit's going to fall upon you. They go back, and as they get there, we kind of get the list of the disciples, all the people who are there. We find out that Mary's there and Jesus' brothers are there, and there's about 120 people in all, including the 11 apostles who are all named in the passage, who are left after the betrayal by Judas. And Peter gets up, as he's apt to do, as the first one to speak, and says, hey, we got to find a replacement for Judas. And we get the story of sort of how they went about that, deciding it needed to be someone who had been with them since the beginning, at least since the baptism of Jesus by John, and that have been there all the way through. They get two essentially candidates, Matthias and Justus, and they decide as they cast lots, I guess the lots or the Spirit decide that Matthias is the one who is going to be up in the 12. So we're going to talk about this today, but I want to talk about it in light of some questions that got sent to me by Maddie Flagmore, who's a close friend of ours and part of the church and ultramarathoner and just a thoughtful person who sent me some questions after my interview with Shelley Rambo. We're specifically talking about trauma in the book of Acts, asking about this scene really, and how this group, the group dynamic, might be affected by not only the trauma of what they've been through watching the person they've been following around for 2 years be brutally beaten and crucified, arrested and all those things, but also having Judas's story be in there in the mix, where not only did this kind of penetrate the small group that they had, the inner circle, the tight-knit group around Jesus, as there was someone that was like in that group that was the one that betrayed Jesus and did sort of what they would have, I'm guessing the rest of them would have seen as unthinkable, and sort of turning him over to the authorities, but also that Judas himself dies in the story, right? I mean, he in the Acts version, Judas buys a field with the silver that he got for betraying Jesus, and falls over and his guts spill out and he dies there in that field. Matthew's version is slightly different. We're not going to worry too much about that for today, but what do we do with the group dynamics? How do we see trauma and grief at play here? Where is that? And of course, in the Bible, we almost never get comment on sort of the inner life and the inner work and the sort of the mental, psychological side of the characters and the stories. Bible just doesn't go there very often. Ancient literature very rarely did. Today, many of the books and things that we read, they're trying to get into the mind of the people in them, or they're kind of psychoanalyzing their own characters as they go. Bible doesn't really do that in any sort of explicit way. We just sort of read from their actions what must have been going on inside of them. And in some ways that's helpful for us because we can really put ourselves in their shoes and think, well, what would I be thinking in this situation? But so we don't get sort of that we don't get a revelation of the inner work of these people. But I think we can see both trauma and grief at work in how this all plays out. These folks they're coming out of a very hard situation. Jesus has asked them to just go to this place and wait, which must have been a really challenging thing for them to not only hear, but to then go and do. Especially for Peter, right? We know Peter's personality. Peter is someone who likes to speak up. He's always the first to speak out, even though he's often, if not usually, wrong in the things that he says or the suggestions that he makes. But he is not someone to sit on his hands, right? And that's not what he wants to do here. And I guess this is the first point of this that I might highlight, is that people grieve in all sorts of different ways, and people respond to trauma in all sorts of different ways. But one of the things about grief and trauma is that they both, one of the main aspects of the experience of those things is this sort of disempowerment, the sense of powerlessness against the thing that has happened or that is happening. When someone dies, or when you lose a job, or when there's some significant loss in your life or relationship, one of the things that kind of we're always butting heads against is just the finality of it, the reality of it, that we don't want to accept because we don't want it to have happened, right? And there's, that's part of if you look at like the 5 stages of grief, we've got denial and sort of argument, and there's a lot of things that are sort of wrestling with the sense of like, can I allow this to be? And of course you can't not allow it. It's not within your ability. That's part of what makes it so hard. But I think that hardness and that particular sort of powerlessness is something that really affects people as they experience grief. And, people, like I said, respond to grief in all sorts of different ways. As a chaplain, we see this a lot. There are many, many ways to grieve appropriately. Many ways to grieve that are normal. We have people that in the midst of the death of a loved one are wailing and yelling and crying, right? We have people that are silent, that kind of go into themselves and just become quiet. There are people who just leave, who don't want to be here anymore, and immediately after just need to get out of there. There are people who tell jokes and who laugh, and there's people who tell stories. And most people are going to do a number of these things, maybe at different times in the grief process. But one of the things that I see most consistently in the hospital is that people respond to the thing that's happened. People grieve by doing. I don't know if that's the best way to say it, but they grieve by sort of beginning to take some action. And so almost every family, if there's like a family unit present, what you'll find is that at least somebody is immediately asking questions about mortuaries and about arrangements and about where does the body of the person go next, and what do I need to do? Where's the paperwork that I need to sign? And this is a way to grieve, actually. I begin calling all the relatives and making, just kind of who do we need to let know and how do we need to respond to this, and just very pragmatic. And I think this is a response to the sense of powerlessness that grief often brings, where if the world feels suddenly out of control, if everything's been sort of thrown up into the air, as often happens when a loved one dies, you're gonna have to take time off work. You're gonna have to, change whatever the holiday plans for the next holidays were coming up. You're gonna have to talk to all these people that you probably haven't talked to in a while or don't talk to consistently. You're gonna have to do all this extra work to arrange a funeral. I mean, your life is gonna sort of be in a bit of chaos. And for a lot of people, one way to work through the grief, to process the experience, is to begin to sort of claim back a little bit of order from the chaos, to begin to set things in order so that they know the schedule, they have a sense of the task list, they have a feeling like they're in control of something. Again, this is a healthy thing to do. Like, not everybody responds this way, but if you do, there's a lot of good in it, right? And again, it's really helpful for each family if you got somebody in the family that's going to start doing all these things, because there is a lot to do a lot of the time. And there's a lot of ways to criticize the ways that people grieve, and people often are critical of one another in their grief. You shouldn't be laughing right now, like someone just died, or you can't shut down. We need you here, or stop yelling. You're making everyone uncomfortable. A big part of my role as a chaplain often is to kind of let people know, like, no, it's okay. It's okay to yell. It's okay to wail. Part of the reason that I'm in this room is to kind of communicate just with my presence that as a staff, as a hospital, like, we understand this is part of the process, and you can make noise. It's okay. No one's going to stop you. You're not being inappropriate. And even if there's a family member that feels awkward about, like, it's okay to kind of normalize some of those experiences. And I guess I want to do that with this sort of impulse to act, to kind of regain some of the order. It is okay and it's normal. And what I see is Peter doing this, right? So he's been asked to go into this room, to sit with the disciples essentially and pray and just wait. And life has got to feel completely out of control for him. and for all of them really, the one that they have been following, that they thought had a plan for everything, has just died. When they were just coming to terms with the fact that he was dead and that life was going to have to be something else, he comes and appears to them. He's resurrected. I mean, Peter had gone back to his life as a fisherman, right? And now he's back in the mix again and wondering, what's next. And then as they begin to get their mind around, okay, we're going to keep following this guy, he's been resurrected, then he ascends to be with the Father. And they've been thrown for a lot of loops, and if like just normal grief and normal experience of trauma, which also has this effect of making you feel powerless, right? Disempowering you. And one of the ways that we work through trauma and begin to heal from trauma is sort of reclaiming some of that power, the same sort of way of like just kind of reclaiming a little bit of control of your life, a little bit of order, a little bit of your schedule, routine, kind of having a sense of normalcy and bringing a little bit of that chaos to heal. Peter is doing those things. He's beginning to process his grief and his trauma, and I think he's trying to help the group process those things by beginning to say, okay, we need a little bit of order here, right? Before all this happened, there was 12 of us. Jesus chose 12 for a reason. They all, I think, assumed that it was, the 12 tribes of Israel. With I think most Bible scholars would tell you, yeah, the 12 represent the 12 tribes of Israel. But I think them assuming that there's a new kingdom coming, right, a kingdom of heaven, that for them, we often think of the kingdom of heaven as this very ethereal, kind of otherworldly thing, but they were expecting it to come to earth, right? As we should be still, but they were really expecting Jesus to essentially bring Rome under his thumb and to overthrow the rule of Rome and do all these things. And I think they were expecting that the 12 would, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, be in these positions of authority and leadership, as if they're going to control a certain region or a certain tribe, or that they're going to have this particular important position in the coming kingdom. And now one of those positions is vacant. And it's vacant because of this horrible thing that's happened with the betrayal of Judas. And his beginning to fill that seat does a couple of things. One, I think it brings some sense of like they're being productive, they're doing something, they're accomplishing something. They're not just waiting around like, here's something that we can do while we're all gathered together. We can replace Judas and we can move forward with the 12, because it seems like Jesus wanted there to be 12. Two, it begins to sort of cut the negative aspect of the narrative out of it. It makes a clean cut for Judas. Now, what I mean by that is that Judas is the one who betrayed Jesus. Of course, Peter also denied Jesus 3 times. The other disciples abandoned him. I mean, none of them were completely innocent in all the things that happened. They all fell asleep when Jesus was asking them to pray. They all had their shortcomings in this. But what identifying Judas as the one who was there to betray Jesus, and seeing him having this prophetic role in the whole thing, it begins to sort of narrow the responsibility of what happened to just Judas, right? And so we can move forward. We can have like a clean start and a fresh start, because the one who's been cut off is done. He's gone. He's dead. And now not only is there no Judas, but we need to fill the hole so there's not even a hole anymore, and we can move forward with a sense of newness and freshness, not afraid that we're going to have a mole in the group or anything like that. That there's this hope for sort of a fresh start, and we can all sort of start with a blank slate. We're going to put, in some ways, this sort of a scapegoating. And I don't mean to be too negative on Peter. Peter's a wonderful, great character that we should admire and follow and all those things. But I think there is a bit of like, okay, we can lay all of our own responsibility and sort of the failure of the disciples, and we can put that on Judas, and we can let Judas go. Judas has been judged for that, and we can let it go, and we can begin fresh with a new 12, like the same 11, and one new person who we know has been here with us all along. So there's some sort of setting things up to move forward. Again, some creating of order, some sort of restabilizing the group, bringing in a new trusted group. So one of the things that trauma does is it breaks trust. It gives us a fear of intimacy, especially this kind of a thing where someone who is so close to you is involved in the traumatic activity. And so part of what Peter is doing, again, also is sort of circling the wagons and bringing in sort of a new trusted group, beginning to build trust within the group, having sort of a sensible way of organizing the group and saying who's going to be in the inner circle, and sort of reestablishing those boundaries and those fronts, which again is it is a response. This is a trauma response, right? And by trauma response, I don't think means something negative. I think this is something positive. This is a helpful way to process the things that they've been through, is to begin to say, okay, who can we trust and why do we trust them? And notice that not only does picking someone who's been there with them the whole time lend credence to them as a witness. Jesus has said, this is your role, is to be witnesses to me. Well, that means they've actually seen him, right? And of course, we're going to have witnesses that haven't seen Jesus. Paul ends up being one of the most profound witnesses, and he encounters Jesus in this vision, but he wasn't there all along. So it's not that you can only be a witness to Jesus if you were there in the moment, but there is a sort of a level of authority, and there's a level of a sort of truth to someone who has actually been there and seen it with their own eyes. So it gives that, right? And there's sort of like a theological and sort of witness testimonial level to this. But the other side of it is that this is somebody that they know and have known for a long time. It's somebody they can trust. And so I think some of the dynamic in the group that we can see that's kind of, if we're looking at this through the lens of trauma, is that Peter is reestablishing sort of an inner circle that is a trustworthy circle, people that they're comfortable with, that they've known for a long time, that have followed Jesus with them for a long time, been through the things that they've been through. You know, it's another way of sort of setting those boundaries and bringing a little bit of order to the chaos so that they can begin to rebuild their own identity as a group and rebuild, this movement that they're going to see move forward. So there's that aspect of it also, right? Another thing that we see for folks that have experienced significant trauma is that their understanding of the world is thrown upside down, right? We talk about this in our flow groups, and I talk about this anytime I'm talking about trauma. So one of the effects is that it undermines how you understand the world, how you understand yourself. It sort of throws everything up in the air because, we all grow up with certain assumptions about how the world works, or at least how it should work. That, if I don't do the wrong thing, I shouldn't get in trouble. If I treat people nice, they should treat me nice. If I work hard, then I should be able to live with a appropriate, I should be able to earn the things that I need if I'm a hard worker. So there's sort of a fairness aspect to it, a justice aspect to it that we have. My kids are always talking they watch these videos on TV, or their streamers that they like to watch, talk about instant karma, right? Like somebody does something wrong and immediately they're hit in the face with something, like they're trying to be mean to someone else in the video, and all of a sudden they fall and crack their own head open or something like that. I think there's a pretty good chance, almost definite chance, that word karma that gets thrown around so much these days is a pretty bad characterization of the kind of the concept of karma in its original spiritual sense. But we do think that way, right? That like if you do bad things, then bad things are going to come back around for you. And what trauma often does is it breaks that line of thinking, because it can't be true, right? Because sometimes I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just crossing the street and this thing happened to me. Or, I'm no more guilty than my brother who was fighting alongside me. Why was he taken and not me? Or why was I injured and not him? And it kind of throws us for a loop and undermines our sense of the order of the world. It can also challenge our understanding of ourselves. We often think, I know that I often think, like, I'm not the kind of person that these things happen to until they happen to you, right? I'm not the kind of person that gets into this kind of trouble until you're in that kind of trouble. You just don't think of yourself as someone who can be victimized in a certain way, or who can have an experience in a certain way, or who's emotionally vulnerable in a certain way, or I'm not a kind of person that cries a lot. I'm not going to cry if this happens. But when you go through it, then it begins to undermine who you know of yourself, right? And who you know of it can be true in a group dynamic of who we are as a group. Who are we supposed to be, and what is our future supposed to look like, and what is supposed to happen with us? Well, I think this may be going on with Peter, that some of this understanding of the world has been thrown upside down. And obviously with the disciples, they thought this whole thing with Jesus as the Messiah was going to go one way, and it's gone a very different way than they expected. And so part of what Peter's doing in the story is he's beginning to find meaning in the story. He's beginning to interpret the story in a way that makes sense to him in his understanding of the world. He's interpreting it through the prophets. He's interpreting it through the Psalms. He's interpreting it through what he knows of the teachings and the direction of Jesus. And he's beginning to say, okay, this is what happened. This must be why it happened. This must be the plan moving forward. He's making meaning out of his experience, in other words, which is, again, it's a way that we can begin to heal and work through trauma. And he's not only doing it himself, he's leading the disciple or the apostles and all of the 120, at least attempting to lead them through this process. So again, we see kind of in the as the brokenness of this traumatic experience, both with Judas and with Jesus, sort of glass shattered everywhere. Peter's beginning to collect the pieces and try to do what he can to sort of begin to put them back together and make some sense of what's happened. And so we see all this going on in Peter and in the group dynamic. We see how trauma has affected them, and we see these responses. Now, that's not to say that these responses are all what they should be doing. I think this is a differentiation we need to make often when we're reading scripture, that just because the Bible says these people did this doesn't mean that we should go and do that thing, or that they were right to do that thing. I mean, as I've mentioned already, Peter was often wrong when he spoke out, or when he said we should do, they're up on the mountain with Elijah and Moses, and Peter says we should build some tents, right? And, well, no, that was not the right response to that. Jesus corrects him, and he's often wrong in what he does. The Bible often just sort of gives us these descriptions of like what someone does, and doesn't make a sort of a moral judgment or a judgment on whether the wisdom of what they were doing. So we don't know. This is not necessarily like a God-ordained thing that all this happened. Now, it turns out that God has used all of these things, and I'm sure as Matthias was added to the 12, he became a key part of the group, and God in the Spirit moved through Matthias and utilized that process to bring about the kingdom of God. But it's not to say that all of Peter's responses are sort of exactly what God would have wanted him to do if God was sort of doing the thing within him. I mean, even now, Jesus isn't there to correct him in this moment. He's ascended. The Spirit hasn't descended upon them. And if there's any time to sort of doubt Peter's judgment, it's now. Now, I'm also not saying that he made the wrong decision. It's just that, Acts is saying this is how it went down. This is how Matthias got added to the group. And again, we can see some of those dynamics of processing their experiences, finding meaning and making meaning of these the two deaths that they've now experienced, finding a way to kind of bring in an inner circle and build a trusted group, regain some sense of intimacy and safety among themselves and in the group. They're processing their trauma and their grief by accomplishing something in their minds, by doing something. Not that prayer is not doing something. Prayer is doing something, right? But sometimes it doesn't feel very pragmatic. Prayer is often specifically not pragmatic. It's often something different. In fact, that's one of the other things that we see them doing that I think is at least in our understanding of trauma, that is significant, is that they've committed themselves to prayer. And we're going to find that kind of comment all throughout Acts, where the disciples or these groups or this person kind of gave themselves over to prayer. And we mostly just disregard it because it's just there so much that we don't even pay attention to it. But prayer is actually another way that we begin to heal and process and move forward from grief and trauma. And by prayer, I don't just mean petitionary prayer, which is often what we think of when we think of prayer, asking God for things. God, I'm praying for this, I'm praying for that, heal this person, help me with this, whatever. Those prayers are great. We should offer petitionary prayer. Those aren't bad things at all. But prayer is much more than that, right? I mean, there's also many forms of contemplative prayer. There's listening prayer. There's meditating on the scriptures. There's praying the Psalms and praying prayers that have been written for us. There's all kinds of more contemplative kinds of prayer. And what practitioners are telling us increasingly today, what experts and scholars and practitioners are telling us, is that one of the key ways to work through trauma, one of the key ways to heal your nervous system, to heal yourself, to begin to feel better, is to participate in what they often call, in sort of a secularized way, mindfulness activities, right? Meditative activities, prayer activities, breathing activities, breath work, regulation, co-regulation, all these things that prayer practices are all of those things often, right? I mean, when we talk about this in our flow groups, when we sing together, which is a form of prayer, we're co-regulating with one another. We're finding sort of a peace together. We're aligning our nervous systems with one another so that we're not dealing with this alone. When we do our deep breathing prayer work, we're self-regulating or regulating our own bodies by bringing our heart rates down and finding a sense of calm and peace and calming our nervous system, letting our nervous system know it's okay here, I'm in a safe place, I'm okay, I don't need to panic right now. Teaching our nervous system to sort of bounce back between those levels of alert and response. Prayer is one of the key ways that we can begin to train our bodies to process our experiences and to sort of find our way forward with a sense of peace. And we see the group explicitly, the text tells us that the group has devoted themselves to prayer, and not only prayer alone, but prayer together, which is a sense of like this communal, community building, trust building, co-regulating practice that's going to help them as they begin to move forward as a group that has processed, experienced, and begun to heal bodily from the traumatic and grief experiences that they've had. So all of these things. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we don't see trauma mentioned specifically in the Bible. I don't think that word existed in the way that we use it then. We don't see the inner life and the inner work and the grief of the disciples sort of expressed explicitly in the text. But if you begin to read their behaviors, you can see how they're processing the activities. You can see a little bit about the group dynamics and how they're making decisions. I mean, Peter's essentially called an all-church meeting, and it's been pointed out by many over the years that this is it's almost like a church that's selecting a new pastor and how they go through the process of sort of discerning who to call to be in this position, and that's what they end up doing with Matthias. Now, again, it's not prescriptive. Like, we don't have to do that ourselves. I don't see many churches casting lots to find out who among their finalists is going to be the candidate that takes on the position. But this is like an organizational thing. And we'll see all through the book of Acts, we'll see these kind of organizational meetings that you think, well, in Acts, it was all spirit-led. Like, they didn't have any structure. They didn't have any hierarchy. They didn't have any of this order. They didn't have business meetings. Well, actually, if you read Acts carefully, you'll see these meetings all over the place. They'll have little council meetings, and they'll make determinations and decisions. They'll pray together and find their way forward together. It's all over the place. So they do this work of sort of gathering, accomplishing something, praying, working through, healing their trauma. I mean, maybe this is part of why Jesus told them to go and wait in Jerusalem, because he knew that they needed some time and some space to process what they'd been through. And again, I want to give them some credit or give, I don't know, maybe even just give ourselves a little breathing room and some space. They probably also needed to grieve the loss of Judas. Not only his death, I mean, maybe they were so angry with him that they were happy that he died. I don't know. But even if he hadn't died, I mean, they lost him, right? It's easy for us to downplay the role of Judas today. We don't know Judas. We don't know what he looked like. We don't know I've never heard him speak. I don't know the tenor of his voice. I've never shared an intimate moment with Judas, talking about, life or family or, sharing my vulnerability with him. You know what I mean? Like, there are people in my life that, and some of them close, some of them far away, that if I were to lose them, it would feel like a big loss. Even if they did something to betray me, or there's still a sense of loss in it. Now, for us, we don't necessarily feel loss for Judas because we never really loved Judas, but Judas was absolutely a part of this group. He was a true and real disciple. He was in the inner 12. He was at the meals that they were at. He saw and participated in the miracles that they saw and participated in. He was in there listening to Jesus and asking questions about the parables. He was there. He left family and friends behind. He did all the things that they did, and he was a legitimate disciple. And so the loss that they have in Judas's betrayal first, and probably also in his death, like, that is a real loss that they must have had to grieve, right? And so some of this, I think, is processing the loss, the death, the resurrection of Jesus, and the opening, the chaos that creates, and all the things that they've been through with Jesus's somewhat chaotic leadership of them, which is going to continue, right? I mean, part of what they're going to find is that however much order they try to create, the Spirit is going to sort of lead them in new ways, and the Spirit's going to work within that order and burst through it at different times. That they can't plan everything that's going to happen, although they are more strategic than you'll think than you might think as we work through Acts. We'll see. Not only that, but that, like, they're dealing with sort of the loss of Judas. They're dealing with the loss of a friend, a disciple, the loss of sort of the sanctity of this inner circle of people that seemed impenetrable, that seemed like whatever may come, like, we are together with Jesus, and Judas has sort of pierced that, right? He's betrayed them and made that an impossibility in some ways. So they're grieving all of those losses. They're processing what they've been through. And here in this passage, they get a moment to grieve, a moment to kind of reclaim a little bit of their own power in their ability to make a decision, to come up with a process to sort of bring some order out of the chaos, to settle themselves, connect with one another, reform the intimacy of the group, and prepare themselves to move towards what's next. So thank you for the great question, Maddie, the great reflection email that you sent me. Rachel's been encouraging me that, I keep saying subscribe and blah, 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 do all the things to give you one task to do. So here's your task this week. I would invite you to leave a comment somewhere, whether it's on YouTube or on whatever podcast app you're listening to, or on our Facebook page or on the website, or an email or a text to me. Find some way to respond to what you've heard today, even if it's just saying, yes, that sounds great to me, I understand what's going on, or if it's, no, you're interpreting this from a completely wrong place, you idiot, you got it wrong. Whatever it is, find a way to respond to this in some way. Take 1 minute, 2 minutes. I mean, you can take an hour if you want to, but I'm just saying, just take a minute or two, if you would. Make a comment on someone else's comment, write a response, respond to this, be a part of the conversation. I read all those things that have come through so far. It hasn't been too many, but I've paying attention to all those things. And who knows, maybe the next episode will be based on something that you send to me or a comment that you've made. Thank you again for joining us. We will see you next week. Again, I'm excited to hopefully have the episode ready with Carrie Willis, chaplain on death row. So don't miss that next week, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you.